Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Those of you who can't join us, this will be recorded, so you'll be able to see it at your convenience. So the reason why we're having this presentation is to further explore the topic of the OPA Retreat, which is Astrology, Bridging Science and Spirituality. Is that you, Brett?
Unmuted.
There's a drum in the back. It must be the spirit. So,
or maybe the science.
So this is obviously, a subject for very long debate, exploring these complex themes. What is science? What is spirituality? But if I can simplify it, and the reason why OPA really chose to go that direction, it is because today we move into a world where, especially in the world of astrology, where there's a lot of knowledge out there, and there's much more interest in astrology. The deeper layers, the ancient traditions, the modern, and we want to better understand what we're doing. It's really part of our identity to better define ourselves. Now, many of us have spiritual practices aside from being astrology consultants. Less people perhaps in the field of astrology come from a background of science. And there's a lot of reaction from the scientific world to the different mechanisms and ideas and concept of astrology. We all know how scientists tend to be prejudiced against astrology, usually without really checking and doing their scientific research about it. But if we define science, as much as we can, I would simplify it by saying science is the ability to decode and understand the mysteries of life using our minds, using our faculties and using measurements through tools, using measurement to establish behavior, to establish patterns, and to explain certain occurrence. So we may say that science helps us make sense of how life works. And there's definitely a scientific aspect to astrology because we use measurement, we use astronomy, we observe natural phenomena and track, the distances of Pluto and the planets, the size of the planets, when they rise, when they set. And the whole field of astronomy is really the research about how the universe, how our solar system at least, is constructed. So we have the data. Now, the spiritual side of astrology is giving meaning to the measurement. The fact that Mercury happens to visually go in a retrograde motion, that's a scientific fact, and that it's an optic illusion. But the spiritual side of it is to understand that it's not random, that there's a greater order in this universe. And that if there is a meaning to that, what is it? So the spiritual side of it comes from the perspective that there is a higher intelligence, and that all these things that happen seemingly through a mechanical mechanism are not empty of meaning and soul in that sense. Now, the other side that astrology, we would like to see astrology moving toward is to combine the interpretation, the spiritual side of astrology with the scientific side, and do more research about our interpretation. For example, is it really a fact that you cannot sign contracts during Mercury retrograde? Is it really a fact that Leos like to be the center stage? So we have all kinds of interpretations which have been inherited from previous traditions and our teachers. And many of us don't really question these. We just apply it because that's what we've been taught. And yet the scientific aspect of it is now testing our results and learning to have better references for the things we use for the interpretation we apply. So that's, maybe the next step. As Jupiter and Saturn, we know, are coming together in Aquarius in December, and they're going to set the tone for the next 20-year cycle at least. We know that this can elevate our knowledge, bring greater scrutiny, increase the visibility of astrology, but also increase the criticism. Because when something gains more visibility, it also attracts more scrutiny. So we need to be, we need to grow up ourselves as astrologers. So the retreat is going to include day one, that theme of bridging science and spirituality, and the speakers will each explore a particular aspect of that. So I'm going to talk about the research, how to perform research, and Roy is going to speak about the science of art, astrology, and karma and reincarnation. And that's already a fusion of spirituality and science. And Ortley is going to speak about the draconic chart, which is related to the fate aspect of our destinies and soul evolution. Honor the spiritual factors in the natal chart. And then in the evening, Shannon is going to lead us into a meditation through the zodiac, which encapsulate, that sense of connection to a higher order. We're also going to explore the argument that are made against astrology. Quite often, these are both spiritual arguments and scientific argument. You have a whole religious community that is also prejudiced against astrology. So the one thing that really unites the church, the spiritual people, and the scientists is their criticism of astrology. But the truth is, we actually unite them both. Now, aside from these presentations, we also have the tracks. Now, the track means that when you sign up for the retreat, you join a particular mentor for 3 days and you go deeper into that subject. As you can see, some of these tracks are sold out because we accept a maximum of 12 people per track. So still open is the asteroid track, the writing workshops. If you want to enhance your practice, you do need to write well. Astrologers write blogs, write articles, write columns, and they usually don't have a training in writing. So that's what Arlen is helping people do, is write properly. And these are simple techniques. Christopher is going to speak about Jupiter and Saturn, and we spoke about their conjunction coming up this year, so this is really timely. And Christopher is an excellent speaker as well. Donna, Foundation of Astrology, for those of you who want to review the basics or are completely new. Now, the interesting thing is that we see many people have their spouses sign up to that track. Like they come because they're advanced in astrology and they, subscribe to a particular track, but then they bring their partner who doesn't know anything. And that's a great opportunity to introduce your partners to astrology and then spend time in Zion and have fun. So my track is full as well on mental health. Roy is going to speak about karma and regeneration, and I'm going to let him further expand on that as we get to him. And Kay Taylor is also sold out, by the way, just a couple of days ago. There was an opening, but it filled up. So not available anymore. Russell, The Sacred Science, which is a wonderful track about the fusion of astrology and science. And he's going to introduce that. And Laura, of course, Uranus and karmic trauma from the perspective of evolutionary astrology. Laura is also a well-known teacher and organizer in the world of astrology. Part 2 consists of 3-day immersion as well. Peer group is only for professional astrologers, and it's part of our certification program. So this is when professionals come together to analyze each other's chart and talk about their marketing and how to enhance their practice. Consulting skills is going to be led by Kay, and that's going to be about not knowing astrology, but unpacking the chart in a way that is the most effective. And then astronomy for astrologer. We talked about science and spirituality. That is definitely, a track that fuses science and spirituality, and Brett is very masterful in that. Now, consider that there are only 2 spots left in consulting skills, 3 spots left in astronomy. So we're really at the tail end of these groups, and there are about 3 spots left in the peer group. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Kay Taylor, who is going to share with us her perspective on science and spirituality, astrology bridging science and spirituality. Thank you, Kay.
Thank you, Maurice. And thank you for the introduction of this topic of science and spirituality. Although I fully recognize the science of astrology, and am also looking forward to more research telling us what's actually true and definable in our astrology interpretations. I feel that's a very strong need. I'm here today to talk about the spiritual side, because that's the perspective I come from, quite frankly. And when we talk about spirituality, the first thing we might think about is, what is spirituality? And I'm deliberately doing this talk today without any slides or anything in the background, because I'd like you to feel what I'm talking about. So I'm going to ask everybody who's listening, even on recording, to take a deep, slow breath, maybe a couple of deep, slow breaths. So as you breathe, you're actually coming into contact with spirituality. You're coming into contact with the breath, which is life, which is connected to who we are as spirit. And if I talk about the deeper levels of spirituality, on a non-dual level, every single thing in life is spiritual. The mundane, worldly, money, body, everything about life is part of our spiritual path. But when we talk about spirituality, I feel that what we think about is our better qualities, what we think of as the meeting point between the different spiritual belief systems and religions in the world, where there's an intersection of gratitude, forgiveness, loving kindness, compassion, patience, non-judgment, so that these qualities are what we tend to believe in and feel are truly spiritual qualities. And in this, I would say that every single aspect of the chart gives us an opportunity to either be in alignment with our spiritual path and spiritual truths when we operate from the higher frequencies of what we know about the astrology. And likewise, we can also stay stuck in medium levels of expression and low levels of expression, and not feel like we are living a spiritual life, or that the astrology interpretations are giving us the spiritual information or the spiritual guidance. I would say that every single aspect of the chart will define our spiritual path in life. And of course, as an evolutionary astrologer, I personally put a lot of emphasis on the nodes, the south node of karma or fate, what we bring in, what we know well, and where we may be a little stuck. And the north node, something about the medicine or the evolution, what we're learning about to integrate and to do a better job with in this life. But even that, as is everything, has the potential for a trick or a spiritual bypass. We can get overly engaged with the past life stories of the nodes, and I was a prince in the 15th century, and I'm a very special healer because I've got this in my chart, I've got my south node. And so we can get a little bit locked up in that too. I like to consider, again, as with every single thing, what are the highest qualities that we're aspiring to? How can we bring our gifts into the world and make them manifest in a way that feels in alignment with truth, with soul, with awakening?
So if I may, addressing some of the things you mentioned, do you feel that how you speak about evolution and about the nodes? If we speak about the spiritual quality of astrology, what about fate and free will? I mean, is our destiny, is the node telling us, that we are fated to a particular development and particular focus? And can astrology really describe that there is a meaning? For example, you're born with Mars square Saturn. You may have conflict with authority. Why me? Like, why was I born with a Mars Saturn? Is it a random fact that I was born during that time? Is there a meaning to the fact that I was born with that aspect? What do you think?
I don't feel that anything in life is particularly random. And I would say if you're born with Mars square Saturn in your chart, this represents a level of undigested feelings and thoughts that are coming in from past lives. I do believe in past lives in a sort of a global holographic way. So I don't necessarily believe that lives are sequential, as we like to think of them in the way of history. But I feel like we have this time and space issue that, maybe someone like Russell can talk about more specifically. But again, I'm talking belief, right? When we talk about belief, then we're talking about spirituality, like what's our sense of truth and meaning, versus something that a scientist has measured and says, okay, there's 550 milligrams of this thing in this thing. So the fate is that there is something that is undigested for us. It's not complete. It's a place where we have a lack or a lesson to learn, something to integrate. But then on top of that, we have our free will with how we relate to it. And this is where I feel that astrology needs to come from a more spiritual perspective in terms of looking at every single time, what is the highest level evolved meaning because a lot of people are going to look at Mars square Saturn and talk about the limitations of Saturn. You're going to have a problem. You're not going to have your success. You're going to try to do what you want to do, and someone in authority is going to try to stop you. So what that does is that delineates a very mundane, worldly interpretation that seems to be stuck in fate and doesn't necessarily talk about the higher spiritual quality of Mars, which is to be alive, to be free, to be able to be connected to the will of soul, the will of spirit, versus the personality will of the human ego. And then the Saturn asks us to have self-discipline, to have a practice, to work hard at something and let go of what's stale. So if we're understanding those two planets in a hard aspect, as this is an inner conflict that we've had for maybe lifetimes, and now is our chance to evolve it, then we're moving into a spiritual interpretation and a spiritual unfolding. And I feel like that happens with every single aspect in the chart.
So now the tricky question is, when you say, the aspect, I don't believe in reincarnation being a linear process, but I believe it, that there's more to life than this incarnation. Now, is that a belief? And if so, is it completely subjective? Or is it something that astrology can really serve as a tool to confirm that? I mean, if I believe in heaven and hell, and I can also project that and say, if you have this aspect in your chart, if you go to Vedic astrology, there are very fatalistic association and interpretation. For example, who can say, this is good fortune and bad fortune. But the question is, are we projecting our subjective beliefs? Or is there a way for astrology to validate that there is a spiritual truth in our experience, in living our charts? I know it's a big question.
That's a big question, Maurice. Thanks a lot for first thing in the morning. Well, for me, when you say that someone might believe in heaven and hell from a spiritual or religious perspective, and how could that be proved? That's not really proven in terms of science. There's a fair amount of information about people who experience near-death experiences and don't find heaven and hell at all, that find a very heart-centered, big spiritual experience for themselves. And I would say that in terms of past lives and reincarnation, my sense of trust in it comes from doing past life regressions for people as a hypnotherapist, which is part of what I do. And the fact that you can remember a past life and do energetic healing work in it, and then have that affect the way you feel and think and operate now in this life, the sort of the center point of consciousness where you are right now, and possibly affect future, then to me, that gives us some indication of the spiritual or energetic truth of astrology.
That's a great point. And my question to you would be, if you do past life regression, do you see those past lives in the chart of the person you're regressing?
Yes, what often happens, I actually feel in the chart there's a number of lives that will show up, so that many times, doing a past life regression for somebody, I've not told them the details of their chart or their karmic nodal story. And that's exactly what I would interpret from the chart is what comes up in their past life regression. But sometimes if I do enough regressions with a person, I'll see that the intense planetary aspects also have a story in them. So say somebody has a T-square, that may be a separate story, different than the nodal story.
Thank you very much. I think that, that brings that question. I mean, we may not solve everything in this talk about science and spirituality, but it brings those important questions. And I'm glad, we could go a little deeper with that. Thank you, Kay.
Thank you.
So, Kay, just a quick word. You're going to lead the consulting skills, correct? Because
Yes.
your track is already full. And the consulting skills with Moon is about basically learning the language of communicating the chart. So 2 spots left for that.
Yes, and I would say about the consulting skills is that astrologers, whether they are brand new to giving professional readings or even senior students, or people who have been doing professional astrology for 20, 30 years, find the consulting skills very beneficial, very helpful for confidence and just a much deeper interaction in their work with clients.
Well, and curbing a lot of the harm that is often done in readings.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, Roy, you wanted to present something about karma and the science of karma. And you're going to speak both on you're going to have a short presentation at the retreat as well as lead a track. So can you introduce your track?
Yes.
And let me know if you have slides to show so I can stop sharing.
Let me share the screen, please.
Okay.
Oops, I'm just this thing working. Have we sharing the screen? I'm just looking at the whole screen, Maurice. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you. And you can share the screen you can just click on the green button at the bottom of the
Just finding it. Wait a minute.
It's a hiding toolbar.
The green button.
Share screen, it says.
Where is it? Is that at the top or the bottom?
Should be at the bottom.
Part of the green share. Okay, found it. So I press that, and then I'm looking for my screen, presumably.
Just click on screen.
Share. And now, can you see it okay, everybody? Yeah?
Yeah, perfect.
Great, okay. Well, hello, everybody. Actually, I'm just listening to that last question that Maurice gave. I might have a point to make on the idea of reincarnation, although that's not really the main emphasis of what I was going to talk about. So what I'm really focusing on is understanding the scientific structure of karma at birth and through life, how that enables us to transform our lives, which might seem a rather strong statement to make, but let's see how it works. Now, where's my mouse going? Here we go. We all know that when we learn in astrology, when you understand the basic ways of calculating a chart, is that it is a mistake to look at a square opposition as a bad aspect and to look at a trine as a good aspect. Rather, squares and oppositions indicate stress, and that stress can be for good or for ill. It can indicate horrible experiences, but it can also indicate great strength and transformative capacity. And also trines and sextiles can indicate an easy flow of energy, but that could be for very bad reasons. If the energy of action flows too strongly, it can be quite dangerous and leave you in very difficult situations. Or if life seems to be going very easily, it can lead to you wasting great opportunities because you haven't structured, you just waste away a happy day, rather like eating a delicious meal too quickly and too strongly and not really getting the benefit of it. But of course, much deeper than that. So the same is true. So it is with all astro factors, not just aspects, but also with ruling planets, for example, can be well or badly used. Planets in fall or detriment can be used by a wise person to live in and transform very difficult situations. People often say, you know, you've got all the planets in awkward signs or in awkward houses. How can you achieve anything? Well, by recognizing that you may have to work with very difficult situations, but therefore be an absolute blessing if your consciousness is working mindfully in those situations. The most obvious example, of course, is a ambulance carrier or a medical worker in the middle of a war. They're doing wonderful, kind things and benefiting many people in terrible situations. So all the astrological factors together indicate karmic challenges we face, and how we react to them determines the imprint in our mind for good or ill. This is where we come to the question that Maurice was asking Kay just now, that for me, he's asking, can you prove reincarnation with a chart? And I would really like Kay's answer that you can see past lives in a chart sometimes, but that's not really the point. The point is, it's the state of mind that you have about the transit that you're experiencing, or the progression you're experiencing, or the birth chart you were born with, that determines where you go in the next incarnation, or where you go in this life as you advance through life. If you look at, if you're always looking for an easy ride, then you'll be constantly dissatisfied. And if you're allowing difficult circumstances to make you react in a very nasty way to situations, to complain and blame other people, then your mind will constantly get worse and worse and worse. And because of my studies of Tibetan Buddhism and their idea of reincarnation, it's my feeling that it's the state of mind at death that takes you to the next lifetime. So it's not necessarily the chart at death and the chart at birth, the next birth, that is we should look at necessarily, but the state of mind we had, which will then protect us to an attachment to be reborn at a point of time and space that we karmically have created for ourselves by the mental attitude with which we died in the previous incarnation. So it's not a simple matter of just technically, scientifically comparing charts.
So my question for you.
Yeah, did you want to ask something about that before I carry on, Maurice?
Yeah, just a quick reference to that. So you are, you know, involving free will in your analysis, as Kay was also mentioning, the ability, you know, to express the chart on a higher level, and to be more aware of what's in your chart and what's in your life. So that's the spiritual aspect of astrology implies that there may be an evolution, that the chart is not static, and that this evolution is not random. You know, you're not just thrown out on a river, but there is a purpose. So we go back to this higher intelligence force behind the chart, that there's something purposeful in everything we experience, whether it's painful or pleasurable.
From the Tibetan point of view, the way my teachers understand them is the chart is a diagrammatic representation of the residual delusion that you brought forward from a previous incarnation, both the positive qualities, if you've created positive qualities, and the negative qualities. And the combination of that is the residue that you have to deal with until you can get past the delusion of seeing life in a relative sense rather than an absolute spiritual sense. I don't want to get too much into Tibetan Dharma teaching, but that is astrology from a Tibetan point of view, in my understanding of it.
So you're referring to the Tibetan philosophy, and they apply that to astrology? is that something that's done in Tibet as well, that they use astrology that way?
The Tibetans do use astrology. It's not the same. Well, they use a system that is similar to the Indian system, but they also have a Chinese system as well. But yes, certainly they would consider that your attitude towards your birth chart and your attitude towards the transits that come up to affect it, you know, as things happen in life, it is to do with that you becoming clear. And that life is a natural challenge to transcend a relative view of reality and see ultimate truth. We could talk a lot about this, but
right. Let's keep
basically it. So what I'm trying to say here is that just think about it from this lifetime. Lasting good outcomes come from kind, understanding minds, and bad outcomes from resentful, hateful minds. And it's not the astrological events that are, however bad they are. So that's the cause. It's the state of our mind. It's our attachment. In this way, our birth chart is a diagrammatic representation of birth karma. That the transits and progressions are opportunities to degenerate or grow spiritually, and so make our minds and experience nastier or freer and happier. So a murderer, for example, tends to be attracted to murderers, and a robber to robbers, and a person with kind, positive, healing attitudes tends to find themselves attracted to those sort of people. Now, let's see if we can get to the next slide. Okay, so a little bit of astrology, I thought, just to help illustrate what I'm talking about. Now, some of you may recognize whose chart this is, but I'm showing it to you blind. And if we had a chance, this is in the class, we'd love to talk about this for about 10 minutes or at least a quarter of an hour to work out how this person's life might experience life. And I'm going to first of all interpret what I think is validly a very negative way, because you could react to this. Like, I was born in this situation. I'm very nervous and sensitive to the world. There's all this cancer energy rising. So I feel that I have to defend myself and put up a barrier against people, or else they might get to me and hurt me, particularly as my ruling planet, the moon, is in Virgo and it's opposed to Saturn. So there's all these strange and alien forces that are coming down on me and and seeming to threaten me. And I'm really confused about it, because the moon is coming up to conjunct Neptune, and I don't know what to say at all, because Mercury is in my 12th house and it's unaspected in Gemini. So although it's in a good sign, I'm really caught up in myself, and I'm very nervous and I don't know what to do. Now, and also the Mars square, the Sun is applying to square the Mars in the 3rd house. So there is a feeling of being attacked all the time. So that's a very, very negative, self-indulgent way of interpreting the chart. So now let's look at whose chart it is. As you can see, the Dalai Lama is considered to be a reincarnation of the Buddha, of Avalokiteshvara, who is the Buddha of compassion. He is the mother of all sentient beings. He is the ocean of wisdom. This is the way he's described by the scriptures, and he's considered to be a consciously reincarnated incarnation of the 13th Dalai Lama. He's the 14th. And by various magical means, they have drawn, people who were searching for the reincarnation, the Dalai Lama, 13th Dalai Lama, drawn to this farmhouse in eastern Tibet, where they found this young boy playing, and they recognized that as a kind of sign from what they had seen in their visions. And then they tested him by presenting him with various objects from his previous incarnation, alongside objects that were nothing to do, similar objects with nothing to do with the previous incarnation. Recognized that he recognized all these objects, and they therefore recognized him as a reincarnation. And he was taken away to the Patola in Lhasa, which is a big, dark building ruled totally by middle to old age men, and taught these very strange teachings, and was only allowed to see his parents and his mother just very occasionally, and his brother. You know, he wasn't treated brutally, but if you look at it from a Western, how you bring up children point of view, it's everything that I've just described. But of course, it's the opposite of what I've just said, in that this Cancer energy, when it's used for the benefit of other people, and the Dalai Lama only lives for the benefit of other people, he doesn't live for his own benefit, it can be projected in a kind of mirror type energy of sensitivity and kindness. And the Saturn opposition to the moon, of course, is the fact of him being born in that situation, taken away from his home, and then when as he was coming to maturity in the training he'd been going through, actually being exiled from his home and being sort of unable to return and fulfill the role that he was born for, but at the same time being able to transcend that horrible Saturn negativity to his ruling planet by becoming a kind of teacher to the whole world and enlightening or helping millions of people for a very long life. And of course, the Mercury in Gemini in the 12th house indicates the monastic tradition, his meditation, his incredible inner wisdom, and so on. And we could go on talking about this at length, but you can see how, because his motivation is for the benefit of others and not for himself, he's not concerned with himself, he's concerned with other people, then this chart comes transformed into the person we know and recognize today.
So another question, Roy.
Yeah.
Is this encapsulating what you will be teaching in your track? Is that...
You're amazing. You always pick up exactly what I'm about to say. Yeah. So what I was going to say was, yes, what Maurice has just said, that obviously those who come on my track will have the opportunity to look at their own lives and the lives of other people that they want to just talk about, you know, as long as those people are happy that they should be discussed. I'm not going to start doing charts for strangers without knowing that there is some sort of permission from that stranger. But at the same time, if there are family members who've given permission, we could include them in it. And we would try and look at the chart and see where it is not functioning so well and how we can learn how to use this astrological energy so positively. I've chosen the Dalai Lama because he's such an extreme example. And I think, you know, we may just spend all our time talking about charts. It won't just be me talking and interpreting. I'll be showing people how to share. We'll probably break into 2 groups or maybe 3, depending on how many people are there, just for short periods to actually compare notes and see how we're getting on and learning from each other. But generally, it's intended to be an individual transformational experience for everyone who comes to the workshop. And now I'm going to move on rather dramatically to a couple of mundane points, because as a lot of you know, I'm into writing mundane astrology, but I've always felt that I'm almost, you know, I write my Working with the Planets columns, which I've been doing for 20 years now, every 2 months, that I'm actually doing the chart of the world, the state of the world. I'm trying to make some sort of comment on the transits, but it's the same motivation to try and put out ideas which suggest how the transits that are coming up could be handled in a way that will benefit others. And I just want to show briefly two extreme examples of, I've gone backwards, haven't I? Oh no, I haven't, that's it, it's good. So I want to show 2 extreme examples of how this has happened in the last 2 decades. And the obvious chart, which I don't want to go on to a great length on, is the 9/11 chart, which I put around the outside of the United States 4th of July 1650 chart. Now, I know there's a lot of arguments about which is the right chart for the USA. Just bear with me on this because we've just got a couple of minutes to look at it. But if we do take that chart as being the right time and date, then we see that Saturn-Pluto opposition. We could see a lot more than that, obviously, but I just really want at this stage to just emphasize the Saturn-Pluto opposition across the ascendant-descendant axis. Clearly, America was destined to go through a major karmic trauma challenge. And the horror of what was done, the outrageousness of what was done, the unreasonableness of what was done, it was so easy to react as it did, in fact, to feel that retribution to the people who've done that is the only way of thinking and only brutality and hatred can be answered with this kind of brutality and hatred. And Saturn, as you can see, was applying to Mars in the natal chart. It had just got past Uranus. Jupiter was opposing the whole thing. You know, the energy of boiling up negativity towards everyone and everything was very strong and understandable, but at the same time, very dangerous, and needed some sort of intelligent consideration. And asking the unaskable question, how could anybody want to do such a thing to us? If someone does something horrible to you, how could anyone want to do such a thing? You have to ask the unaskable question, but it never was asked. I know that His Holiness was in America just shortly before this, and he did actually meet George Bush, and he did write to George Bush afterwards and make the point that, you know, you've got to try and see it from the other point of view. That's not necessarily just live with it, but so, and it wasn't really listened to. So what was to happen is, why should, the question I'm asking you, why do they hate us so much? It was never asked. It wasn't considered. Revenge was preferred. And then the strange idea to go to Iraq, which wasn't particularly connected with the actual, you know, the attack on the Twin Towers. And this was, you see the Saturn, Pluto, now is on the Mars of the natal chart when the Gulf War, the Iraq War started. And there was another factor here, which was the Jupiter-Neptune opposition, which was very close. This opposition, it was very linked to when the Middle East was structured after World War II, and also to George Bush and Tony Blair's chart as well. And it was this idea that we can actually reform the Middle East and make it into a kind of Western democracy. I mention this now because we all know how things have gone in the 20 years, nearly, or 15 to 20 years since. And we know, I think most people would now agree that it wasn't quite the most skillful way of handling the situation, and that the world may yet suffer many, many inconveniences. The whole question of security affects every one of us when we travel anywhere, as well as the horrible things that happen in many countries of the world. It's an example, and why I mention this particularly is because when it happened, I was writing, trying to say, don't take it, you know, don't get it wrong, you know, and it's a bit terrible being a kind of Cassandra type figure, watching history unfold when you know that the decisions that are being made are not really taking account of the transits that we're having to deal with. And so lastly, well, it might be useful to just jump in the conclusion to the coronavirus, which is just given a formal name today. The chart on the left-hand side is of the moment that the idea of the virus was first reported to the World Health Organization. It was on the 31st of December 2019. It was just recognized as a new virus that had never been seen before. And you can see that, in a way, we've been talking as astrologers that this year, 2020, is going to be the consequences. It's going to come to a head. Much is going to come to a head. And already in just 6 weeks, we've had the most terrible things, one thing after another happening. But I think this virus is particularly focused. I mean, I could give a long talk, obviously, on all the background factors, but basically just look at I've done it for noon, which makes it even more traumatic, but at the same time, Mercury was applying to Jupiter, and then it was going to go on and continue to conjunct all that stellium of Capricorn, and a major Uranus trine to that, and obviously right on the nodal axis. So it's a point of karmic challenge for the world to stop putting up barriers and try and take advantage of other people behind barriers, and forget about barriers and start thinking about how you're going to cooperate. Now, you do put up barriers against the virus, but you're working together, everyone, to prevent it spreading. And everyone has to be honest and truthful with each other, or it's going to get worse. And there's nothing you can avoid. There's no trick you can play that's going to send you in. So it's a real karmic challenge to the world. And the chart on the right-hand side is when the first human contact when human to human was proved for the first time. That was on the 21st of January, very recently. And we know in the news what's happened since, and you can see that Mercury has now gone right the way past the stellium. The stellium is edging its way into Aquarius, but we've still got the really quite terrible transits, and we've got those to deal with through the year. So this is a karmic challenge that is so big, it could be so big, that it could transform and bring the world together when it's hovering at the moment on a very precipitous situation. I think looking at astrology in this way, in the mundane sense, can be very beneficial. And I commend it about all levels of using astrology to judge the best way to act as a very spiritual and yet very practically spiritual way of improving our lives and the lives of everyone around us.
So to recap your point, just to make sure we understand, you were basically giving these examples to show that during these transits, whether it was the 9/11 event or the current crisis, you're speaking about the transits are there, but how we respond has that spiritual reference. You know, how do we choose to act upon the trigger?
And if we act upon them in a selfish, greedy, greedy, ignorant, and hateful way, then we get the situation that only gets worse. Similarly, if we avoid, I mean, like another obvious example was the Saturn transit through Cancer about 3 years before the 2008 crash, subprime crash. I mean, when we should have been consolidating and structuring and being more restrained in our attitude towards prime property, we were encouraging it like mad. And similarly, since 2008, the Capricorn energy, we've been ignoring it, and we're bringing the world to a point of extinction. Or a lot of people are feeling we're bringing the world to a point of extinction because we are ignoring the Capricorn reality of organising a world that is sustainable rather than just growing all the time. So, I mean, these are just factors we learn from. And just in our ordinary lives, our individual lives, we have to take a good spiritual, positive attitude if we're going to live happy lives. So it is in our society and the world we live in.
Thank you so much, Roy. And we look forward to April in the spiritual environment of Zion, the promised land of Zion, and get there with very scientific means. So thank you, and let's invite Brett.
Greetings all, how are you?
Thank you.
Roy, amazing, and Kay, thank you so much. It's always just incredible to hear from these peers. It was nice to be in peer group recently, so for the first time I can really testify that that is a process that I can recommend that all astrologers and really all human beings get after. So did you say there's spots left open for the peer group in Zion? Yeah. So if anyone needs another recommendation, highly recommend it. I just did it for the first time and it was amazing. What I will be teaching at Zion is astronomy for astrologers. I'll be giving one short talk during part one, which I call What in the Heavens is the Zodiac? And I was tempted to show a little bit of that today, but I'm not going to. But because it's my favorite kind of merging of science and spirituality through the image of astrology. I think like Russell's doing really incredible work where we're getting at the very roots of number and nature. And I'm looking in many ways for a natural or even three-dimensional mechanism of why astrology works, like why this tropical zodiac is a thing. Some of that is, I think, just to address the cynic in me. But But most of it is because I feel that astrology, and especially tropical astrology, is the result of a subtle energy field that if we could learn to harness, as I believe the ancients, like the pyramid builders did, that we could create a type of energy that's earth first instead of against the earth. And so I think that we as astrologers who are honoring this amazing thing that we often just share as above, so below, that the heavenly harmonies and the celestial symphonies somehow are influencing our energetic experience as earthlings. I think this is coming from inside the earth. And so I'll look forward to sharing about that in Zion in the first talk, a short talk, because there's a lot of problems that, astronomers or especially rationalist scientists are staking some really important claims in their attempt to prove astrology fake that I think we have to address. The constellations aren't the same size. The tropical signs are in no way aligned to the constellations, and in some sense never can be. What about the seasonal issue? Many people say the tropical zodiac is a seasonal happening. Well, if so, then shouldn't we have to reverse the order of the signs for the Southern Hemisphere, which has a seasonal opposition? And most astrologers don't, and I don't believe we should, and I'll show you why we shouldn't. In brief, at the short talk during part 1, but my greatest contribution to Zion will be in part 2, where I will be teaching astronomy for astrologers, which I prefer to call sacred astronomy. And that in many ways coming from one of our sister arts. So
I want to just
schools, go ahead, Maurice.
Just before you share with us the content, I do want to highlight the thing you said, is that we need to take our critics seriously, because many of the arguments are valid arguments, even though many scientists did not do their own research as they claim they have towards astrology. It's important for us not to validate ourselves and not to say we're so scientific, but it's about our own growth and learning from critical thinking, which is lacking in astrology. There's not enough critical thinking. So thank you for bringing that up and addressing that.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think importantly, if we go into these challenges instead of run away from them, and I mean, we've been speaking about past lives some here today. I mean, astrologers were burned at the stake simply for practicing this craft. That's probably the oldest science known, and so there might be some of that in our fields. And in some sense, why should we learn astronomy anyway? I mean, we have the tables, they're built into our softwares. I don't need to know the phase of the moon, in the sky to see what it is in a chart these days. I think we've really been disconnected from half of our craft, because in the mystery traditions, it was known that astrology is the bridge between astronomy, the measurable heavens, the quantity of the heavenly happenings, and correspondences, which is how the more immeasurable experiences here on earth of those heavenly happenings. Yeah. And I find that when we have some of these attacks, and we do the learning necessary, first of all, we're reclaiming some of the astronomer, it would seem that these astronomers are choosing to forget. And I think that's important, because astronomy today, for the most part, is really narrowing the view and looking so far away. There's something about, well, how do we experience this marriage of heaven and earth when we lay on the back and just open our eyes, in the grass of our planet? And so some of that's retreating, but also in the challenge of these attacks, there is an invitation for us to ask this question of, if it's not constellational, if it's not seasonal, then what is it, this tropical zodiac? And that brings us into some really incredible truths that I think will open really wide windows into a new shape. So speaking of shapes, traditionally geometry, which maybe it's easier to swallow if we call it sacred geometry these days, is one of the sister crafts of astrology. And so was harmony. And the former geometry known as number in space, while harmony, frequency, number in time. So these, in a sense, are what astronomy, number in space and time, is composed of. So it's the study of these crafts that are really been great teachers to me in the last few years, in the quadrivium, the sacred sciences. And all of these things, like the seed of life construction or the 12 half steps of a chromatic octave in the Western harmonic tradition, they all have these 12 signs, or 12-ness, I can say. And I like to say creation creates in 12. And so I'll be speaking a lot at the Astronomy for Astrologers Retreat Part 2 about, the astronomical idea of why there's 12 signs, which is related to the sun, the moon, and the earth, right? And also the complications there. The complications with the music, and complications less so with the geometry, but with astronomy, it's not perfectly 12. And it's a really important thing, I think, for us to address. But today I thought I'd get a little bit more mystical, since in Zion I'm going to be kind of speaking more from the rational or the scientific side. For people who want to take these last few spots in Astronomy for Astrologers, I call it sacred astronomy for a reason. This is about connecting to the energies of the heavens. This isn't just learning the celestial equator and the ecliptic and where they cross and, this kind of nerdy science class approach. We do a lot in being outside and sitting with our shadow and being with the sky and really connecting.
But that's the essence of bridging science and spirituality.
Yeah, I mean, the essence of bridging science and spirituality is experience. We really need to be careful in either of these things to be creating an experience based on what we want to see or what we want to believe in. So today I want to speak about the Emerald Tablets of Hermes some, where he speaks about the 3 parts of the philosophy of the whole world. And these can be described in many ways. One is circle, crescent, and cross. We're usually taught in astrology that the circle is spirit, the crescent is soul, and the cross is matter. And then usually the page is turned. Maybe we'll hear that the circle over the cross is Venus, and therefore Venus is about spirit over matter. But it's the geometry tradition which has really helped me see that these things astronomically are most conveyed by sun, moon, and earth. And I think Hermes is telling us of how these 3 parts of the philosophy of the whole world speak to the incarnational path and how we get here. So we've heard a bunch about the lunar nodes today, which we often call the head of the serpent and the tail of the serpent, and even the way the serpent slithers reveals their shapes. K2, the south lunar node, draws its glyph from the head of the king cobra. And, this is because the moon every month is snaking above and below the path of the sun from Earth's point of view. The crossing points are these lunar nodes. These nodes are such amazing things because in a sense, they're where the sun and the moon and the earth all agree in every moment's time. Here we see the sun and the moon, Apollo and Diana attacking the dragon with their clubs. Usually we see this done with their bows. And, watching an eclipse really helps us see the only time when you can see Apollo's bow, right? Apollo is the sun. And when the moon comes to eclipse the sun, you see that bow. Well, in the myth, Apollo catches up to this dragon who had chased his mother when she was pregnant with the twins. That's him, Apollo, sun, and his sister Diana, moon. And later in life, he catches up to that dragon and he shoots an arrow from his bow right through it. Well, that bow is the solar eclipse. The arrow is the line we can draw through the centers of the earth, moon, and sun, which we see with our eyes during a solar eclipse. But in every moment in time, it's activated by the nodes. Diana's bow is a much more frequent experience, right? Diana's bow comes to us every month after new moon, this waxing sliver crescent where Diana is shooting arrows at her brother Apollo, who is just set below, and it's about phase. And phase is just as much a thing of these 3 parts, sun, moon, and earth, right? It's from Earth's point of view, the conjunctions and separations of moon and sun. It's just as much these 3 things as is the story of the nodes, which we see, by the way, in Mercury's caduceus staffs. And he left for us this great writing called the Emerald Tablets of Hermes. And I'll warn you that there's an Emerald Tablets of Thoth that was this channeled thing in the 70s. The Emerald Tablets of Hermes is a much older text. Some say older than Moses, and maybe the oldest spiritual text that we know of, at least in the Western tradition. The oldest translation we've caught to, which found its way back to consciousness, at least publicly, during the Renaissance. In fact, it very likely sparked the Renaissance, as Cosimo de' Medici had his agents scouring the globe for scriptures in all of the lands. And actually, when the Corpus Hermetica was found and brought back to Florence, they stopped the translation of Plato to get into the Hermetic texts. I mean, this is how important these texts were. And etymological research has been conducted that suggests that the Hermes text goes back to the Hellenistic era, which was the birth of Western astrology. But it might just be we're connecting to a translation from that time of something that is much, much older. So I'm going to read through this text. I know I don't have too much time, but I'm just going to read the Hermes Emerald Tablet. This is mostly from Isaac Newton's translation. Newton, who was far too much a mystic to be considered in modern parlance Newtonian, interestingly. But he worked on Hermes Emerald Tablet, and this isn't only his translation. I've also borrowed from Fulcanelli and from a Persian translation to really deepen into the astronomy of the tablet. We usually just say as above, so below. But the first rubric from the tablet is this: "'Tis true without lying, certain and most true. That which is below is like that which is above, and that which is above is like that which is below, to do the miracles of one only thing. And as all things have been, and arose from one by the mediation of one, so all things have their birth from this one thing by adaptation. The sun is its father, the moon its mother, the wind hath carried it in its belly, the earth its nurse. The father of all perfection in the whole world is here. Its force is entire if it be converted into earth. Separate thou the earth from the fire, the subtle from the gross, sweetly and with great ingenuity. It ascends from the earth to the heavens, and again it descends to the earth, achieving the force of things superior and inferior. By this means you shall have the glory of the whole world, and thereby all obscurity shall fly from you. Its force is above all force, for it vanquishes every subtle thing and penetrates every solid thing. So the world was created, and the marvelous conjunctions of it, for this is the process by which these marvels may be brought about. Hence I am called Hermes, Trismegistus, having the three parts of the philosophy of the whole world. That which I have said of the operation of the sun is accomplished and ended." Now, we need a lifetime to really decode this thing, but I invite you to sit with this. I'll correct that word that says covered. It should be say converted. And really contemplate how this might be working astronomically and what it might say about the path of soul. And so spirit, soul, and matter, as above, so below. But why? To do the miracles of one only thing. And I think very importantly, at the end of the transmission, we hear from Hermes, that which I have said of the operation of the sun is accomplished and ended. So is Hermes calling sun the one and only thing? I think this is a really interesting contemplation, right? I mean, it might be that astrology itself has not become so sun-centered until the Copernican revolution of a sun-centered solar system, but we hear in much older texts where the sun is certainly at the center of this text. I love an old cosmology, which is not that the stars are these burning furnaces in the sky, but rather they are holes in the heavens in the tapestry where we get to see the one light. And that the sun is this closest hole where the one light of spirit is coming through. And I just like to think of the sun, which is the only one which I can't tell you when I look at it in the sky, which stars it's aligned to, right? And if I look too long, I get burned or might go blind. There's something about the sun that is great mystery itself. And I think here locally, the sun is this representative of the one and only thing. Call that God is God, universe, what have you. And the great miracle that happens is when the one becomes two, or the not two. And this is the birth of soul. So the general idea, and Hermes says this in the second line, all things have been. There's nothing new under the sun is another way that that's been said. And arose from one through the mediation of one. So all things have their birth from this one thing through adaptation. Geometrically, I'd say translation. And very importantly, there are some translations of the tablet that say through the meditation of one. And I think this is really beautiful because it's in our lives, and many of us have come to astrology because we've started contemplating ourselves, and many of us come to start considering ourselves because of traumatic experiences in life that stimulates this awakening. And we want to look at ourselves. And the great miracle that the traditions can't really convey of how it's done is that the one and only thing somehow thought about itself. And when it did, this one thing, which I'll call spirit, duplicated itself, and the not two were born. And this is the idea of soul. So my experience, or at least translations of what soul must be, it's not a little piece of the one and only thing, but rather an entire adaptation. Or to speak about astronomy, an entire reflection of the whole thing. Now, astronomically, I literally do not have to get beyond the sun and the moon in your chart to show you that that condition can never, ever repeat exactly as it was in the moment of your birth. We are all absolutely unique. No chart will ever be the same. Maurice, I see you're about to speak. Let me just float one more minute, if you will. Because I want to show you how, as according to the Pythagorean tradition, where they said when one becomes two, then three and four, and how it is necessary for when spirit reflects itself through soul, it must embody into matter. So first, let me just say that this reflection, it can go in any way, and it's the many phases of the moon. They can wax, they can wane. We can even get to a place where we'll never see the moon shape show, which is actually just showing these not two in the state of eclipse, the coming together of the not two things, the diamond ring, which is symbolic of this sacred marriage. So the one considers itself, becomes two, and now we have two centers, and we have two intersections, and the cross of matter is instantaneously born when spirit reflects itself through soul. And for me, these are represented by spirit, sun, soul, moon, and matter, earth. So the trick of this thing, especially when we see it at its kind of fullest reach, is that here on earth, with the human eye, we can see that spirit and soul are the same size. So a very fast forward look through what I've gleaned most through Hermes' Emerald Tablet. I'll say one last thing, which is this magic of four. You can see that when one becomes two, then three or four, the cross is born. I'm a saxophone player. I require a saxophone to make the sound called saxophone, and that's the four. Because there's this third thing, and Hermes speaks of it as the wind that hath carried it in its belly, which is the intention for creation. That's the most mysterious thing. The four of saxophone sound, that's here on earth, the material world, and that's a human life in a sense. But the way that a saxophone sound moves you versus how it would move Maurice or Russ or Roy or Kay or me, that's the five, because you bring your own soul, your own reflection of spirit to this place. So I'm just realizing how ambitious it was to try to speak about the Emerald Tablets, because I'd love to look at every one of these lines with you. I'll do that another time and maybe post something at my website sometime soon. So that's GeminiBrett.com if you want to find that there. And most importantly, hopefully this conveys that the Astronomy for Astrologers retreat won't only be like nerdy classroom things. There'll be a lot of beautiful animations. There'll be a lot of time out under the sky, but we will also take a mystic approach by looking at the texts of those who created our craft long ago.
So thank you, Gemini. I want to reiterate the point of our of our presentation. And I would say, first of all, your graphic design skills are a perfect fusion of science and spirituality, because you bring a lot of technique and soul and life into your demonstration. So that's one thing. I wanted to go back to your slide about Diana and the moon.
Yeah.
Because I think this...
Do you want me to show it, or just we've seen it? Sure, okay. Yeah, let me bring it up.
I think, you know, through all your presentation, I feel that that's what we do as astrologers, or that's what we should do as astrologers. I think it was the next slide with her, the mythological. So what do we see here? You know, we see the moon, which is a natural phenomena, you know, the moon, the crescent moon after a new moon or before a new moon. And that's a perfectly scientific measurement. And yet we apply a myth. And where is that myth coming from? You know, from ancient traditions. A lot of the myth of different cultures come together and echo each other through different times and different places. So what we see here is our craft as astrologers, that we use these measurements, but we bring a spiritual interpretation.
Think about how many stories we've heard, like from the Indian tradition, from the Philippines, from native traditions, from China, of eclipses, whether solar or lunar, with serpents or dragons. And this is, as I showed before, the reason why the snake in the lunar nodes, which is where new moons or full moons have to meet for us to experience an eclipse, the reason why the serpent is because the moon snakes above and below the sun's path. So most new moons are not solar eclipses. Yeah, and you know, this to me is like such a great tale. Like, it's often lost that, well, the Greek tradition had this story of the sun and the moon and the serpents too. I mean, the very birth of the sun and the moon was their mother pregnant, being chased by this dragon. And we often conveyed the spiritual, and let me say the scientific truths, and encapsulated them in the fairy tales, or encapsulated them in the myths, and put them in safe places where they would be transmitted and the information can get passed along, whether people are trying to hear it or not. And when the church was burning so much of the divine information at the stake, they were safe places for them to dream and rest and be kind of time release pills, so that when we're activated through hearing these great stories of old, some of us will say, wait, what is that really about? And people like Russell ask these questions.
Yeah. And Russell will thank you for your patience, and everyone. And I think from what we're also seeing is that we start from something that's very nerdy, like you say. You know, we start from the fact, from the data, when is the moon rising, where is Venus, what's the distance, just very dry facts. To that, we apply something very spiritual, we apply myth, we apply interpretation, and the stories of our lives. And we see that there is a reflection in the sky to what happens here, you know, in our daily existence. And then we return to the science by needing to do statistical research and see that our interpretations are not just fanciful, and it's not only bias or belief, but that there is, you know, a scientific reference to our interpretation, and to the fact that, yes, Mars does activate aggression or war or whatnot. And then we return to the spiritual by understanding the unifying factor of all these components.
Yeah,
so
I totally agree.
The dance, just the dance that you were talking with the serpent going above and below is very much that continual dialogue between science and spirituality.
Yeah, and you'll hear in the tablets too. He says, you know, it ascends from the earth to the heavens, and again it descends to the earth, achieving things superior and inferior, which does not mean better than and worse than, but above and below, right? Connecting these two worlds. And yeah, I mean, I can agree more, Maurice, about this approach about kind of going back and forth between the quality and the quantity. Although I like to start with the latter. You know, I'm sitting outside and I'm watching the sunset, and it's like, wait a second, that didn't set in the same place than it did last month. And what's happening here? Like, why is the moon so much higher tonight than it was last night? And then that brings me, you know, just from my experience of it, then I start asking these kind of questions of the astronomy, and then going there, I see these roots of the astrological rules that we're using. And then now these two things are integrating. So that's my passion, to bring people, not in a nerdy way, although of course we're going to get nerdy and talk about declinations and equators and ecliptics and things, but to bring people in a heart-centered way, in an experiential way. Like the first thing we'll do is go outside and put a stick in the ground and watch what the shadow does throughout the course of the day, so that we can reconnect to the oldest kind of astrology, which was simply sitting here witnessing the glory of a sunrise and feeling what it means to your heart, you know.
So we'll have robes for everyone to really embody it perfectly. Thank you so much, Gemini.
My treat.
Looking forward to the promised land of Zion.
See you there.
Russ, thank you. You're muted. I'm unmuting.
How's that?
Perfect.
Great. Let's see if I can share with you my screen real quick. See if this works. Oh. Share. How's that? Can you see the screen, Maurice?
Yeah. Looks purple
Okay.
to me.
You see a purple screen. Okay. All right. Well, I'm just going to roll with the slides that I have in front of me, and I threw this together roughly this morning. So we will just roll with it. So thank you. It's always wonderful following Brett, because he's got so much of the same information that I do, in looking at it in a slightly different way. But it's so interrelated, and each person here has touched on some subject or some part of a subject in which I dabble in, or I find a lot of integration with. So for this brief few moments we have talking about science and spirituality, I want to think of it in terms of remembrance, that we are actually just recalling, you know, the sacred science that's been come before us and that we are all a part of. This energy field is actually something that we are just redescribing, reassimilating, reawakening to, and its sacredness, and that dimension of spirituality. Where ancient and modern meet is what we're dealing with now. All of this ancient knowledge that has been preserved for us in waking up in our age, being re-acknowledged, it has to be contented with as far as how atheistic or imperialistic science has come to see itself. So this quote that I've used many times, this is regarding spirituality, art, and science in Egypt. They were inextricably entwined, so that there was no art that wasn't religious, no religion that wasn't philosophical, no philosophy that wasn't scientific, and no science that wasn't art. Our art of astrology is the same as science to the ancient Egyptians, and astrologer and Egyptologist John C. Anthony West, who recently passed, made that statement. This is another wonderful acknowledgement of where we are in this context of science. Science for the pre-modern mind cannot be divorced from the study of ultimate metaphysical truths, and thus can only be preparatory for a mystical union. Before the 1650s, the astrological and astronomical traditions were still melded together as one. There was no separation from the two. And it was only with the rise of the industrial age that we saw this separation and empirical nature of science that began to discount the metaphysical wisdom and truth that we find in astrological traditions. And I think what Angela is working with Ficino's astrological music theory, and she's written a book on this. But looking from this point of view, we have to remember that they are inseparable prior to modern times. And part of what we're moving into is the reunification of that. Contemporary science is the pursuit of knowledge. Natal astrology is the science of view. Everything that we learn is designed to know ourselves. Astrology is the meeting place of both of these disciplines, and we cannot excommunicate one or the other. Those who are spiritual like to say science is not up to par with where we are in consciousness. And those who are scientific say spiritualists are woo-woo. And what they don't understand is both are actually just coming at these from a different perspective, different aspects.
So just to
sure.
recap some of what you were saying about the history of this, do you think that part of the reason why there was a split or a rupture and the scientific movement gained traction, in the Renaissance, was that because there was an abuse of spirituality or a misuse, maybe, using religious justifications to, manipulate the system and things, or manipulate people?
Well, definitely that is very prevalent, and that is part of it. I think that, when we look beyond the surface, I actually agree that there are many political things that were transpiring around that time with the development of science, where we are in contemporary science, and how spirituality, the church, religion had overstepped their bounds. And this was a long process of the separation from the church and from the church and state. And, so this played itself out with astrology and science and astronomy as well. They removed themselves from each other because there was a lot of discord with how they saw each other, in a sense. And I don't think this was ever fully removed from the true scientists, such as Newton, who never separated himself from alchemy. Newton understood that these were one, but it wasn't a popular thing to say. It wasn't, at that point, it wasn't a popular thing to indulge oneself in. And today, if you mention that Newton was practicing alchemy and he spent more time doing that, that's heresy to the Royal Society of London. You don't say that because he's their go-to guy, And
the same with Galileo and astronomy.
Same with Galileo.
So just one, to reiterate and bridge that, I believe that if we don't integrate both, if we are too mental about it, we're going to experience a crisis. And it's going to create some kind of backlash. And if we overindulge in the spiritual without critical thinking, we end up fanciful and we end up losing touch, with what is really happening. Spirit without science is dangerous, just as much as science without spirit is dangerous.
Well, that's why you see this fracture in our world today, is because the prevailing paradigm, which is scientific and physically dominated, wants to separate this spiritual concept. We're reaching this polar point where it no longer can function with this as a modus operandi. It cannot continue to do this. So I think this is where we are the bridge. We have to come back in and reintegrate as astrologers, because we are this meeting place between these spiritual dimension, as above, so below. We are the mediators. We're like we talked about it in Sedona. We're the priesthood that mediate the voice of the heavens, the knowledge of the heavens, down to earth, into what's happening in the practical world society. We are here to help bolster that language so that people understand where we are on the path of evolution. And looking at it just from a scientific or study-oriented point of view, each one of these is part of the discipline of science and part of the discipline of astrology. You cannot separate these. This emerging quantum science field is fascinating to me, because you begin to find that all energy, everything that we're experiencing, that we describe as sound or light or frequency in astrology, when you look at it and talk about it these ways, the music of the spheres and so forth, you can see the same dynamics playing themselves out with what's happening with quantum science. So I think this is actually going to be a benefit to astrology as we move forward, because these language actually are speaking the same in the same tone, just from different points of view. I think the Vedic astrologers really grasped this, and they integrated so much of this knowledge for us to reawaken ourselves to, that it's undeniable with where science is today. So, these are inseparable fields, and I think that we have to continue to look at them this way. Though modern science wants to completely remove itself from the woo-woo that it places upon us, eventually there will be a tide shift that we realize that these things are unable to be separable. So, and I just want to give a bolster to Brett on this, because astronomy is integrated with astrology in such a way in scientific development that it can never fully be extracted from from the disciplines of empirical rigor and study themselves. We went into astrology and astronomy along with the development of society. Thousands of years ago, we looked to the stars to understand our path of the future, even if it was daily or seasonally, and it began to grow from there. It was just a reawakening of what's happening in nature and our part in the cycles in it. So this has always been difficult for me, at least in the last decade or so, to remove my thinking from one or the other, with science and astrology. They're just not separate.
What do you think? I mean, we know what could happen to, let's say, the church if there's no critical thinking. But what could happen to astronomers or to scientists if they don't re-engage spiritually? Like, what is the risk for them in that chasm?
Well, right now, unfortunately, we've removed most of the risk, and it's actually favorable to side with physical science. You get a grant by saying you're going to test something rigorously, empirically, statistically. You don't get one by saying how you're going to bridge these two realms. So right now, the pendulum is swung to it's in favor of all the physical aspects that would bolster a physical, mundane world. But I think that we're seeing that we cannot continue to operate that way. And eventually, and slowly, this is actually happening now, I believe, that the scientists are beginning to wake up that we have to have a spiritual core, a purpose to help one another.
Otherwise,
and I think this,
what
well, humanity
happen?
Well, the fear factor is that we go into an apocalyptic state because we're so unconscious when we destroy ourselves chemically or we blow each other up. There's that. But I think that we are going to have to return. We are returning to this spiritual core. I can't say that it won't happen. You can see that it's going to happen because part of the process is this reunification of spirit and matter, which will instigate this change. There's no possibility that you can see. You could almost say mathematically, there's no way around this precipice that we are on, that these two fields will be reintegrated at some point.
So the risk is like you say, a form of destruction because knowledge becomes dangerous, misused, if there are no spiritual references.
Right. Yes. We have to look at it in spiritual terms.
And knowledge can also be limited. Like there's so much you can discover, like you're going to reach the limits of your discovery if you don't bring a spiritual dimension to it.
Exactly. And I didn't actually make that point, but thank you for making that for me, because there's only so much that these current monkey bodies can hold of either one. We can only contain so much knowledge or so much energy of change or whatever the dimension is. We are not designed until we make the shift to hold more knowledge, more spiritual connection, more transcendent energy to continue to evolve. So we will be shedding, in evolutionary terms, you could look at it, we're going from the ape to the man, and then we're going to go from the man to the transhuman. where beyond human existence. But it takes this shift of and a reintegration of higher and lower knowledge for this to happen. So, and I think that this is exactly what all alchemists and astrologers are trying to get at. Egyptian astrology, in some sense, is designed to transcend the planets, designed to transcend human nature itself, so that we become more connected to the divine, to the celestial energies that we are a part of. So this pursuit can be seen through, I have this example here. Astrologers are spiritual geometrists. We're always looking at things from an aspect or an angle to tackle these situations in our own psyche. How do we reintegrate? How do we bring as above, so below into one central core, the masculine and feminine, the left and the right? How do we make that unification happen? And I think all science, willingly and knowingly, or unwillingly and unknowingly, both are at this core. There's no escaping this. So, alchemy itself, which I'll be dealing with some of this in my track, is about how to raise and sustain a higher mind, higher thinking, so that we can continue to transcend and continue to evolve. I love this image where all of the impurities are being cooked out of the mind, so that we can dissolve. It's the dissolution of our boundaries or our story, so that we can move into the higher state, the God story, the God mind, stop being stuck in this human condition that we put ourselves in, so we help everyone. Hopefully you can see these images. I won't go through all of these, but you can see that there's a connection here with this principle, as above, so below, as without, so within, that we're working to attain a central core. That's what Hermetic philosophy or Hermetic astrology is actually about. The hermaphroditic principle that has to happen so we can take the next step and rise above. The masculine and feminine integration. So this is a slide I just threw in because at the IVC 18, we were looking at this in forms of frequency. I actually forget who was presenting on this, but so this is something that's being looked at from so many approaches in many different fields. I don't think we're alone in this understanding that this energetic, this electrical field that's around us is something we need to understand as it begins to grow, as we transcend. And just to throw in some a little more science to this, the past and the future collide. So anyone know what this is? Brett probably knows what this is. Yeah. The collider. The super collider. Yeah, this is the Hadron Super Collider. And one of the things that I like to think about is that particles, planets, and people are all just different scalar levels of consciousness. So when we're exploring the particles in at the subatomic level and below, that we're looking at the same mirror image that's happening in the local heavens, our solar system and our galaxy, and the cosmos as a whole. So the scientists, I don't care if it's the most atheistic person working at CERN, he's doing the metaphysical work for us. They're actually on our side. And I think this is why we cannot divorce ourselves from their language. We have to step up and take it on ourselves, that we need to learn, hey, a little math won't hurt us, a little bit of quantum mechanics won't hurt us, So I'll be talking just a little bit at my track on this. So you can see this in images coming out. Particle physics, the understanding of the small is the same as the understanding of the celestial, cosmic,
So you say you're going to talk a little bit about this. What are you going to talk a lot about?
Well, actually, the part that I'm going to talk quite a bit about is an integration of this, how sacred geometry and mathematics actually prove or show some of these connections between as above, so below, particles and planets, and how the people, the psychological behaviors that we analyze through astrology is the meeting ground between these two correspondence levels.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And in some ways, it has to do also with the chakra system, where we see the heart as the midpoint between the lower and the higher. Like, if you don't bring it to the emotions, if you don't bring it to the heart, then you're going to stay stuck in the upper realm or stuck in the mud.
Exactly. Maurice, if you take an image of a vortex around your body, the head is outside of the center, And the lower chakras are outside of the center. The heart is the nexus. It all has to integrate in the nexus so we can realize our singular purpose here in life. We have to bring it from the heart. So I love this quote as well. The reason the pattern in the stars is repeated in the pattern of your life is because there is only one pattern to begin with. This one central pattern comes out and interfaces with itself in frequency and energy infinitely. And we are part of that infinity. So theory versus research. Yes, we've got to get down to doing some actual research as astrologers. We can't leave that out. So since this is something I just threw in at the last minute that's been on my mind lately, one of the ways I came into understanding some of this mathematical principle was I was kind of just wanting to be left alone about 10 or 12 years ago. And I started getting these downloads, all these mathematical codes and information, and I got obsessed with it, and I couldn't describe why. I was spending 18 hours a day writing and scribbling notes about math and the Fibonacci sequence. And I was hearing this voice in my head. And after a few months of this, I talked to a professor at UT, University of Texas, and they said, you know, what you're describing sounds a lot like Gottfried Leibniz from the late 1600s. And so I was like, yeah, okay. So Gottfried and Leibniz and I got into a dialogue, you know, being dead, it's interesting to connect with that energy. I consider that kind of a reincarnated frequency interaction. But only recently did I pull his chart. And so this is me, my chart on one side with 19 degrees Sagittarius. And this is him, born in 1646. 19 degrees Sagittarius, both Sun in Cancer, a few degrees off, and Mercury in Gemini. So I believe there's something. Taurus. Yeah, there's something to this frequency of the archetypal energies that delivers this information, whether we like it or not. Energy and information come together, they meet in us, and they have to be expressed one way or another through time, past and future. It all meets in us in the heart. So when we're operating from the heart, I believe we can tap into this core information and this knowledge, this wisdom that's required to make this next step. So this is just one of the studies and one of the things I may talk about a little bit at the OPA retreat. So again, at OPA, some of the things just listed here, we're going to be working with the alchemy of the planets, how it relates to us, reintegration of knowledge and wisdom. We may even throw in some to talk about the asteroids. I think that's on the table. I would like anyone who comes to my trek is going to go home with a bottle of astrological salts, the biosalts. We're going to work with what their purpose is, how they relate, scientific study behind them, and actually making one ourselves. So this is a chart of how this relates. This is in the field study of biosalt. Also going to be working with how to vibrate the body so that we can better connect to and clarify these frequencies in our chakra points, and each of these relating to the planet. All sound, frequency, and vibration integrate and relate, and we're gonna put that knowing and intention into a short practice. So threw this in for Brett as well, about how I ran across this recently about the lower and higher octaves, that the planets are really just low frequencies. They're more dense frequencies of the energy that we are experiencing at a higher octave on Earth as organic beings, and light would be even a higher frequency of this. Several people are doing work in this area. I know Brett is doing a lot of work in this area. We may throw in some information about how the particles and the asteroids, relate. That these chemical makeups that the asteroids are created through. One is metal, one is carbaceous, one is I forget, not gaseous, but anyway. So each one of these energies relates to something happening in us, and how the asteroids are actually important as we grow in our consciousness. This more refined aspect, smaller and smaller parts of ourselves have to become awakened. We have to be aware of what's going on inside of our bodies. So like I said, we are the spiritual technology. We're the vessels for it. So let's put it to use. And we are here one of our purposes here is to break the fourth wall, this illusion that we are separate from God and man. We'll also be doing the illumination dance to help integrate this. We're going to stir the vessel with dance, and that will be with Shannon Gill, and I will be doing that. So hopefully that's enough to get you stirred up and want to join the OPA Zion Retreat.
Wonderful, thank you.
And that's my new website as of yesterday, Maurice.
If I wasn't teaching, I would have joined, this track. I love this fusion of spirit and science.
Great.
So, thank you everyone so much. Think about joining the retreat. It's an investment, but we need to invest in astrology. We need to invest in our education. This is really an amazing faculty, people coming with the highest knowledge. We really hope you'll be able to make it. And if you can't, join OPA. Some of you are on Facebook. Some of you are, just joining some of our OPA live presentations. We thank you for your support. Godspeed.
Thank you, Maurice.
Yeah, thanks everybody. I have been here listening. I'm very impressed by both those presentations. Thank you, Brett and Russell, very much.
Thanks, Roy.
All the best to everyone.
See you in Zion.
See you in Zion, the
Bye.
promised land.